years ago, a group of armed rebels charged into this building, having come to the conclusion that only bloodshed could bring about Ireland's independence. Tonight on Primetime, the central question that may have got lost in all the commemorations: were they right?
And what of those who suffered terrible loss during the Rising? Are we really remembering all the victims of the violence that started that Easter weekend equally? Or is it still only a celebration of the side that was ultimately victorious?
Hello and welcome to the programme. Tonight we're in the GPO, 100 years after it was the centre of one of the most dramatic and seminal moments in the history of this country, the Easter Rising. In this centenary year, there's been much commemoration of the Rising and many new permanent reminders of what went on in 1916, including the new Witness History visitor attraction, which opens here in the GPO next Tuesday. But in the midst of commemoration, questions remain, particularly around the ethics of the use of force by an unelected group to secure their aims. In short, was the Rising justified? Later, we'll be hearing from relatives of some of those involved in the Rising and debating those issues with a panel of experts. But first, Barry Cummins has been journeying back in time to ask the uncomfortable questions.
And he said, all of us that are going out tonight, he said, believe that we have saved the soul of Ireland, that we have struck the first successful blow to freedom.
Ours is a complicated and troubling history. 100 years ago, Ireland was part of the United Kingdom. A mass democratic movement existed here, demanding a form of self-government. A Home Rule Bill had been passed by Parliament in London, but with the First World War, its enactment was postponed. A small group of people believed this all wasn't enough. They believed true Irish self-determination could only be achieved through violence. Did the conditions that existed in 1916 justify that decision? Was warfare and all the death and destruction and bloodshed that it brings, was it the only way?
In every generation, the Irish people have asserted their right to national freedom and sovereignty. 6 times during the past 300 years, they've asserted it in arms.
On the 1st of January this year, the state marked the beginning of centenary commemorations by reading out the names of the volunteers killed in 1916.
Eamon Cant.
Philip Clark.
Thomas Clark.
The names of others who died, civilians, policemen, British soldiers, were not given the same treatment.
I've always been troubled by the tension between these two things. The Republic of Ireland, which I certainly grew up thinking was a good thing, and I still think it is today, and the violence that went into creating it.
There was a tendency to portray the army of the Republic as a highly noble, almost saintly group of people, but in fact they killed plenty of people.
I can't see a justification because they had absolutely no mandate at all.
Does it mean that if they didn't have a mandate, that the men and women of 1916 were terrorists?
I'm concerned about emotive language like that because it's not a term that was much kicked around then. But I will say, did they have much more validity than the anarchists who were going around throwing bombs at buildings? No.
Did they have the right to use violence to achieve freedom? Were other peaceful routes open to self-government? Possibly, Home Rule may have been achievable. In 1916 you had a British government which included people like Carson, Unionists and Tories, who were enemies of Home Rule. You could turn the question around and say, well, did Britain have a mandate to rule Ireland? I mean, the Irish electorate had voted overwhelmingly since the 1880s for some kind of self-government. Some Republicans probably would have felt that Home Rule would have led naturally, would have been the next phase of development. But I think also a lot of them would have been quite alarmed by the idea of Home Rule because Republicans stood for complete freedom, complete separation.
Back then, Dublin City was where people lived, and the poorest lived in tenements in the heart of the capital. When rebels brought war to Dublin, the consequences were horrific. Close to 500 people died that Easter week. Over 70 rebels were killed. More than a dozen policemen died. Over 110 British soldiers were killed. But the majority of those who lost their lives were non-combatants, people with simply nowhere to go. Close to 260 civilians were killed in Easter week, including almost 40 children.
Bridget Stewart is in that grave on her own. There's nobody else in the grave. You know, the parents obviously were buried somewhere else. With every conflict, civilians always pay the biggest price. We have 14 combatants, we have 10 soldiers and we have 4 volunteers. We have 35 civilians.
We name housing developments and streets and hospitals and sports grounds after the leaders of the Rising. We name train stations after them. But let's go back in time to ask just who were the small group of people who took up arms against British rule 100 years ago, and were they justified?
Be very careful about 21st century values being applied to 1916. So when we talk about justification, we have to be very careful about reading backwards. When people talk about democracy, when people talk about mandates, we're often thinking in a very 21st century way.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. You are all very welcome to the 1916 Freedom Tour. My name is Jerry, I'll be your guide, and our driver here is Mick. The Irish Volunteers in 1914 imported 900 Mauser rifles, very similar to this.
Earlier, I met my tour guide, retired Garda Jerry Lovett, at the scene of the first killing of the Rising.
The one group that are still being airbrushed from the narrative are the police. They were the sons of Irishmen, like the men and women in the Garda Síochána. Constable James O'Brien, aged 48, he was from County Limerick. He was on duty here on the morning of the 24th of April 1916. A party of Irish Citizen Army, led by Sean Connolly, approached the gate. Constable O'Brien went to shut the gate in front of them, and Connolly raised his rifle and shot him dead at point-blank range.
We were in the parish of Lino, and this is, Kilfergus Cemetery.
It's somewhat inglorious that the first death in the Rising was an unarmed policeman. I met his grandnephew, Gus O'Connor, in County Limerick, close to the Kerry border.
That's what he later is known in. Said he was a man of 6'4", 16 or 17 stone, and he won a medal, a national medal in tug of war. And he was 21 years, I think, in the Guards when he was shot. I thought it was a desperate thing to happen. That he, especially when I found out that he was unarmed and just standing there doing his duty, and he just threw his arm, it seems to stop a man going in, and he was shot dead.
The rebels of 1916 were made up of a number of groups: Cumann na Món, the Irish Volunteers, and the Irish Citizen Army.
I think you could suggest that the Citizen Army are slightly more hard cases. They're born out of the great industrial disputes of 1913, and they have a lot of experience of combat against the employer's forces. So they're probably sort of mentally mobilised for violence more than the volunteers were.
Sean Connolly, who shot dead Constable O'Brien, was himself killed on the roof of City Hall by a British sniper a short time later. Over at Stephen's Green, the Irish Citizen Army shot dead another unarmed policeman.
A young policeman called Michael Laheath from County Clare was shot and killed up near the Harcourt Street junction by, we're told, Constance Markievicz.
Countess Constance Markievicz was a committed rebel leader. I visited her original home, Lissadell in County Sligo, where the current owner shows me a fascinating record of notes the Countess made in advance of the Rising.
it talks about the points of attack. And you can see here, Barry, that references are made to various areas where the points of attack are, how many men there are, 200 men at Dublin Castle. And then she talks about the front gate and attack front gate.
In that she led the group of the Citizens' Army up around Stephen's Green.
Yes.
They were involved in some of the really heavy fighting that
That's
week.
right, and she was personally involved in that and has been criticised, in fact, for killing a constable. Maybe she didn't realise the man was unarmed, or maybe it was a split-second decision. It was a wrong thing to do. Of course, it was a wrong thing to do. But I suppose tempers and passions and emotions were very high.
Countess Markievicz was an ardent admirer of James Connolly, one of the 7 signatories of the proclamation.
Now, the main party of volunteers left the Liberty Hall, led by Pearse, Connolly, Clark, etc. They marched up to the front of the GPO. Connolly gave the order to halt, turning to the left turn, the GPO charge. These photographs are from inside the GPO. You can see there only one of them has a uniform. And the guy on the right here looks about 14.
In terms of the leadership thinking, you're looking at maybe 3 different groups of people. You've got the cultural nationalist intellectuals, Pearse, MacDonagh, Plunkett. They're very influenced by kind of romantic nationalism. Then you've got James Connolly, who kind of stands on his own in terms of the Irish Citizen Army and a kind of a socialist analysis. And then you've got Clark and McDermott, and they're kind of Fenian revolutionaries. And we've got socialists, nationalists, Republicans, separatists. So I think we're very careful about imposing one kind of set of values on the rising.
Joseph Plunkett, a man with no military experience, devised the rebel strategy of taking buildings and holding on for as long as possible.
He did, I know. It was just another romantic amateur's adventure, you know. It was nonsensical. Infused with, he greatly admired Connolly when he got to know him, with Connolly, who had been in the British Army, Connolly saying, this will be all fine because the British won't use artillery because they'll defend capitalist property. So he was completely blinded by ideology. They hadn't a clue what they were doing.
The idea of taking key city centre buildings is also a reminder that it's not just about military strategy, it's propaganda. You know, it's this defiant gesture in the heart of Dublin City and taking these key buildings and essentially saying that we are reclaiming our city.
The plan that they adopted ensured that there would be huge consequences for the civil population of Dublin. It's a situation in which the potential for death and destruction is enormous, and of course the British then played their part in that by using artillery. It's a very dramatic moment when the British forces start shelling one of their own major cities.
While the volunteers were fighting a losing battle in Dublin, Ashburne in County Meath saw the only rebel victory that week. 50 men led by Thomas Ashe and Richard Mulcahy attacked the local RIC station and ambushed police reinforcements. What happened on these country roads in Ashburne that day became known as guerrilla warfare. The volunteers ambushed the police, firing across the hedges from both sides. The police tried to take shelter in the ditches. The exchange of gunfire was intense. After a number of hours, when it was all over, 2 volunteers and 9 policemen were dead.
My father felt that they should attack from behind the hedges and all the rest. After a couple of hours, I think, all the RIC people, they retired. And unfortunately, there were 9 deaths.
Richard Mulcahy, the architect of the military victory that day, would go on to become Commander-in-Chief of the Free State Army.
He never spoke about Ashburne, but what was very significant about him was when they were celebrating Ashburne. Of course, my father was the obvious person to be there, but he refused to go and wouldn't give a reason. I think he must have had some feelings about the unfortunate outcome, the actual killing of 9 Irishmen.
The memorial unveiled in Ashburne in 1959 bears no mention of the 9 policemen who died. In 1920, Richard Mulcahy married Mary Min Ryan, who in 1916 had been engaged to Sean McDermott.
I think that if Sean McDermott, and particularly Clark, hadn't been there, there would never have been 1916. They were the linchpin of the whole thing, particularly Clark.
Tom Clark differs from the other signatories. He served 15 years penal servitude in an English jail for his part in a bombing campaign in London.
Clark does have a remarkable resilience and focus, and he is capable of great hate, but he's also someone who does not want to be centre stage. He has to be careful anyway because of his prison record, but he is much more comfortable working behind the scenes and trying to instill in the next generation that same sense of resolve and focus, and indeed hatred, that he had.
Somebody like Tom Clark wouldn't give a damn what it took. He just didn't. He was utterly ruthless. He never ever lost sight of the fact that what he lived for was to get the Brits out of Ireland.
And the obvious time to try to achieve this would have been when Britain was at war.
When the war breaks out in the summer of 1914, Republicans are hugely despondent about the state of affairs. There's quite strong public support for the British Army. There's this idea that a violent act is not just necessary, but a violent act can transform public opinion. I mean, if you don't rise in a time of war, what's the point in being a revolutionary Republican? When else are you going to rise?
The war in Europe was to see 38 million deaths, including thousands of Irishmen who fought in British uniform. This year marks the centenary of the Battle of the Somme. In 1916, a small group of Irishmen engaged in war against Britain, while a larger group fought for it. The City of Nottingham War Memorial, remembering all British soldiers who died in war, included in that number 28 members of the Sherwood Foresters killed by Irish volunteers in the Battle of Mount Street Bridge in 1916. One of those to die was Captain Frederick Dietrichson.
This is the book. It's written by members of the Nottinghamshire Law Society who fell in the Great War, and there are some photographs. Indeed, there's one here of Frederick Dietrichson.
Frederick Dietrichson signed up to fight in France, but he was diverted to Ireland with fellow Sherwood Foresters. The order to advance over Mount Street Bridge, but a small group of volunteers ambushed them, as one man who was there recalled 50 years later.
We could see the British troops approaching from the other side of Paddington Road. Mick Malone and Jimmy Grace opened fire on them. When they came in our view, then we opened fire.
The shooting was intense. The British strategy was similar to that at the Battle of the Somme. Soldiers repeatedly ordered to advance straight towards the enemy. They eventually took the bridge, but at great loss of life. Captain Dietrichson was one of the first to die. In Oxfordshire, his granddaughters Tessa and Nicola tell me how as he marched towards Dublin from Dunleary, Frederick had a chance meeting with his wife and children shortly before his death. They had left Nottingham for Dublin to escape Zeppelin raids.
She was a Dublin girl, and she must have heard the news that the British troops were outside, and she went to cheer them on. And so it was a real chance meeting for both of them. They both thought the other one was somewhere else.
Well, I think that if he had been fighting in France and been killed, it would have been much worse. He would have had possibly a horrible time in the trenches. Whereas in Dublin, he'd just seen his family and he was shot. I think it was a much better death, actually, than if he'd been killed in the mud in Flanders or the Somme.
Frederick Dietrichson is buried in Dunleary Rathdown's Dean's Grange Cemetery, one of 49 victims of the Rising here.
There's also 3 other Sherwood foresters that are buried in the cemetery. Nearly everybody that was buried in here was just a single gunshot, was just caught by an unlucky shot, you know, or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
One grave holds the bodies of 1 British soldier, 2 volunteers and 3 civilians.
They were brought in from Dublin and they were in blankets because at the time they had to get the bodies off the streets. Graves were opened and the bodies were just dumped in them.
Some were killed deliberately. The North King Street massacre saw 15 innocent people, including a father and son, killed by British soldiers who broke through the interconnecting walls of houses to avoid snipers.
They actually committed an act of savagery, really, in killing these men, because not only did they shoot them, but they bayoneted them. It was a real act of savagery against a child, a 16-year-old child, you know.
There are other children here as well, though, John.
There are, just one here, Bridget Stewart. She was aged 11 years of age. We have a young girl, Mary Kelly, who was 12 years of age. Mary was unfortunately shot. She was from Townsend Street. She was shot by a stray bullet.
6 days after the Rising began, and with civilian loss of life on a scale unimagined by the rebel leaders, Pádraig Pearse surrendered on behalf of the provisional government.
I have a strange relationship with Pearse, you might say, because I started out at the very beginning not liking him, the little I knew, and I ended up curiously fond of him. I think Yeats was right. I think he was nuts, actually, in many respects. I also think he was extraordinarily selfless, gifted, kind. He had many, many, many virtues. There was nothing self-serving about him except wanting to have his name and deeds live after him. You know, the hell with the consequences. They'll remember me.
Over 10 days, 14 leaders of the Rising were executed at Kilmainham Jail.
The British Army tried to do more than just execute the leaders. It wanted to use this moment of retribution to finally crush them. So they rounded up thousands of people, actually, who were suspected on the basis of somewhat inadequate police information of being sympathisers or potential rebels. And that sweep, that had a huge effect.
So what happened? The Irish always respond to the martyrdom thing. We just do, it's in our DNA. And from baying for the blood of the people who were responsible for wrecking Dublin, everybody's saying, oh, isn't this terrible? They are terribly misfortunate people. And there is no sense of perspective. I mean, we had 250,000 Irish people fighting in the British Army, and they're forgotten about and ignored, because they're not romantic. What's romantic are these men to whom mythical qualities are assigned, going to face the firing squad. It's theatre.
The Rising is an iconic event, which means that it's always changing. We're always reading into it what contemporary society wants to see. And at any given time, there's competing visions of 1916. For example, 1916 has never been regarded in the same way north of the border as south of the border. In the south, 1916 is a kind of, it's bound up with the attainment of independence, with national sovereignty and so on. And of course, for obvious reasons, north of the border, 1916 is unfinished business.
Frederick Dietrichson's granddaughters will soon visit the place where he died, in a rising that initially lacked popular support, but which sowed the seeds that led to our independence. They would like to see all the dead of Easter week remembered.
It would be nice to walk, perhaps, along the Black Rock Road and just get a feeling of the place, really, and then perhaps to Mount Street and look at the canal and the bridges and things.
This was more like a terrorist incident, which in some ways we have feelings that they were justified, because we look back at history, we're not really proud of all the English involvement in Ireland. If I was asked about a monument, I would like it to be a peace monument, rather than one glorifying one particular side.
Violence can ever be justified. Perhaps it can be forgiven. I think one can understand and certainly forgive, or try to forgive. The other question is whether something unequivocally good can come out of a situation of violence. And perhaps we are still haunted in some way by our violent past.
Join us here in the GPO, the epicentre of the rising, where in just a few minutes we'll be debating all these issues.